All right, well, thank you. First of all, thank you for a wonderful introduction and for letting the cat out of the bag about the fact that I blackmailed my way into the basketball team by being a minibus driver, but that's fine. That's best left in the past. Hello, first of all. Can everyone hear me okay before we do anything else? People are nodding. That's great. There are people all over. I didn't realize there were people up at the top as well. There's like the corporate boxes with the high rollers up there, so hello up there. So as Una says, my name's Phil Hawksworth, and we are going to do some Q&A at the end, but we'll just see how we do for time. Hopefully we'll have time for that. If we don't have time to get to that, you can tweet your questions at me as well, or grab me. I'll be around for the next couple of days, but you can tweet questions at me, at Phil Hawksworth. That's me. I'm incredibly excited to be here at Smashing. Smashing is also one of my favorite events, so very, very excited to kind of get that email arrive from Vitaly saying, would you be interested in coming and speaking at the first Smashing in London? Hell yes, of course I would. That's always very exciting. But my excitement was suddenly kind of replaced with terror, because as I kind of look at the way we're going to progress through the day, there's some awesome speaker that, I want to see him speak, and then there's like some other awesome speaker, I definitely want to hear her talk as well, and then there's another awesome speaker, so brilliant, and then there's me, hello, and then, there was another awesome speaker, so I was thinking to myself, well, I don't want to speak after that person, because that's the worst possible place to talk. I want to speak after her, that would be a nightmare as well. So what I managed to do is gradually over time, I've kind of worked my way out of trouble from one nightmare scenario following an amazing speaker to the point that I had to follow Vitaly and Patrick and Una doing the lovely introduction, but thankfully I don't have to follow a talk. So that's good for me, if for nothing else. So I've kind of managed to do this kind of bubble sort as I've managed to get myself out of trouble. My background, I've been making things on the web for almost 20 years now, and until quite recently, I was working at an agency who were just around the corner, actually, called RGA. And RGA make all kinds of stuff. They make exciting experiences. They make things for the web. They make things that power the screens at Old Street Roundabout, all kinds of things around us they make. And so I was involved there for 6 years, figuring out how to make things and make things work and work fast. And then at the end of last year, I moved over to Netlify, who are one of the sponsors here today. I moved over to Netlify, working on spreading the word about how Netlify build things and how you can use it. Now, I've only recently made that transition, so I'm nervous. I'm nervous about the fact that I used to rant about how great I thought Netlify were, and now I work for them, so this is dangerous territory, isn't it? I could be starting off the conference with a 40-minute sales pitch. We don't want to do that. I'm very cautious about doing that. I am going to be mentioning that company and showing some examples, but everything that I'm talking about, I think it's the process and the fundamentals that are behind it that just happen to be part of Netlify. So in the spirit of making sure that I don't turn it into a sales pitch, I think it's important to talk about some of the competitors and other people in that space. Give everyone the same kind of oxygen that I might be giving the company I work for. So let's do that. I think that seems fair. That seems reasonable. No, let's do this properly. So it's difficult to kind of say who are competitors, but often hear people talk about the company I now work for in the same breath as some of these companies. So certainly we're not a competitor to Azure or Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud, but there are some commonalities there. There are some things that happen that are similar. And likewise, you may have come across companies like Surge. Do people know Surge? Yes, a few people know Surge. Like really simple way of doing like rapid deployments of static sites up onto the web. And similarly, Zeit have a product called Now, and their whole kind of ecosystem is really enabling lots of kind of impressive infrastructure and ways to build and deploy sites. So we kind of live in that kind of space. So enough of that for the moment. I also need to come clean about the fact that I have a bit of a track record when it comes to doing talks. Yes, I worked at this fancy agency for a long time, but I was basically their tame nerd. I didn't always do the fancy, flashy stuff. And I've done talks in the past about static site generators, content management systems, the sexiest possible of all topics. So I'm kind of cautious about how I open this event, not going down like one of these cul-de-sacs and something that might not be that exciting. So my goal for this talk, of course, is to jazz it up. It's time to take at least the talk title to the next level, which is why I've gone for this. This is silly. this is a mistake right out of the gate. I can't even say this out loud. I don't know how anyone else is doing with it. Making platforms and processes promote performance. Idiot. Why would I ever do that? And also, it doesn't sound very exciting. And even if I try to dress it up, yeah, more interested now? It's the same words. That's okay. This stuff might not sound exotic or new, and in fact, it isn't. In fact, this talk is really about fundamentals. That's what I'm wanting to talk about. We learn a lot at conferences, and Smashing is a fantastic example of that. Throughout the next couple of days, we're going to hear all kinds of techniques and tools and approaches we can use to make our sites more performant. And I think it's really important that we don't just let those practices be confined to our development environments. We need to get these out into the world. We need to make sure these get to production. I want to make sure that we do the right things to make sure the good stuff gets into the hands of our users. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the processes that enable that. That, again, great 30 minutes of talk about process. That should maybe not be that exciting. But actually, when you think about performance and how we enable performance, so much has to come from the fundamentals. We used to focus a lot at the back end, and then Steve Sauder came along and started talking about all of the gains we could make if we focus on the front-end engineering. Absolutely right, we've made huge leaps there. But if we're not careful, we can take our eye off the ball about where we serve these things from and how we get things out into the hands of the users. So I'm thinking a little bit about the fundamentals. Laura Hogan talked, she had this fantastic book, Designing for Performance, which, anyone read that book? Anyone know the book? Yeah, a few handfuls. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. In that she really talks about how performance isn't something that we build in at the end, and it has to be designed in from the very beginning. And I think this goes beyond just the design that we might sometimes think about. This also we need to design the infrastructure that provides that performance. We need to design the way that we do deployments to enable that performance. The processes that we're going to go through, we need to design those to safeguard performance. And even down to the mindset that we have as we work on projects, we need to craft that quite carefully if we're going to do a good job of delivering things that are performant. So, over the next 30 minutes or so, what I want to do is I want to talk about where does it hurt? Where are our pain points when we're building things for the web that we're trying to make performant? I'm going to do that. Vitaly mentioned stories earlier on. I'm going to do that by talking through 3 stories that are kind of personal to me that I've been through, share some successes and, oh yes, some failures to try and help kind of illustrate this. And that will take us through to kind of looking at the kind of mindset and the resources that we could use to make a better job of safeguarding performance. So that's the plan. So let's start with where does it hurt? So it probably isn't going to come as a big surprise that projects usually tend to include clients, deadlines, complexity. That's not much of a spoiler alert there. But these kind of things can bring slightly sleepless nights. There's some anxiety that can come with that. If we look at the perfect project timeline, we can start to see where some of this complexity and this pain creeps in. So, this is a kind of a typical timeline from inception to delivery of a project. At the very beginning of a project, we'll receive the brief, we'll figure out, what it is the client wants us to do, and at the end, we'll collect the awards. Any questions so far? Is everyone okay with this? Okay. Now, of course, nothing's perfect when it comes to a project. Things are always a little bit imperfect. For starters, we haven't done any work here yet. So at some point, we're going to have to actually start doing some work. And also, before we can collect the awards, we probably need to launch something. To figure out what we're going to actually launch, we'll probably have to have some conversations about scope. Again, I'm dropping all of the sexy terms into this talk. So we'll figure out, what is the scope of the project before we can start it. And then, to make sure that we've actually delivered on that scope, the client's going to want to have some kind of final sign-off at the end of the project. In order to give that sign-off, there's going to be some kind of review where they kind of look through and compare what we promised to what we've delivered, of course. And so with that in mind, we can actually start, and we'll start doing our work, cranking out code, building things, getting it out into the world. We're getting into a bit of a rhythm. The client review is coming up. It's usually at that point that we rescope, because then we discover, oh, actually, the truth of it is something slightly different. So the goalposts shift a little bit. And then after that rescope happens, we start building more. We're starting to build at a faster pace now, because the review is still in the same place and we're approaching it quickly. It's starting to get a bit panicky. And then we have the client review. And it's not quite ready for the final sign-off, so there's an even bigger flurry of activity. Things start getting messy here. This is where it's like a bit panicky. All of the processes that we put in place, if we're not careful, they can start to break down. We're rushing out this deployment. I don't know why it's over here. It should be on the line, right? So something's gone wrong. So we've built something that looks about right, but it's not something that we can deploy. We're scrambling to get back on track. And then I don't know what this is. This is not what we should have had at all. So now there's something that's the wrong shape in the wrong place. Things are going awry as we're scrambling to that final sign-off. We bring things back together. We do some more work. We get to the point that we can get the final sign-off, and then we're ready to go. Except, of course, it's final sign-off is something many of us have experienced. After final sign-off, we need to do some more work. Then we can launch, after we've done a few more bits of work, to do the fixes to get it up. I'm just suggesting that this is complex. There's stuff here that's difficult to manage, and that's before we even get to talk about some of the details of the code that we're writing. All of this leads up to the point that on launch day, it's nerve-wracking. I think MailChimp nailed this. If anyone sent out an email to lots and lots of people, this is the button that MailChimp have you push, and it really encapsulates the nervousness of doing that. This is what launch day can feel like for a lot of projects, and it has done for a long time, because there's a lot at stake and there's lots of moving parts. So projects can be hard. That shouldn't be a surprise. Projects usually involve learning, and they involve change, and that can be scary, and it can be a hard thing to manage. The fact that infrastructure has changed so much over the years really can be something that we can use to help us with that. Our approach to infrastructure has changed quite a lot. Again, if we kind of draw a timeline over a bigger period of time, it used to be that we'd be hosting our sites with infrastructure that was on site. The first job I had, we had a server room, and I was involved in plugging in bits of metal into power supplies that we managed in a room that we managed. It's very, very different, to where it came. Now, after a while, we started renting some rack space, and I do not mean rack space. I mean space in a physical rack in a building where the networking was there provided for us, the power infrastructure was there, but we were effectively renting space in a rack. From there, it moved on to starting to have virtual servers, which might be actually rack space, but it gets confusing. But we're moving kind of away from physical things to the virtual and starting to use software as a service to kind of to host our sites. And now we're getting to this kind of state that people talk about serverless. I prefer to call it functions as a service. It means the same thing, but this is really what we're talking about, where we're buying cycle time on machines that are completely managed for us. We don't really have a concept of the server that's running it. We're just buying time running functions. So with this kind of change in infrastructure, that means that we've got new development conventions, new deployment conventions at play. And that's the part that I want to focus on a little bit, because that helps us have a slightly different approach that can help us safeguard what we build and keep things like performance really tight and the way that we want them. It fosters a slightly different mindset. So managing change is where it hurts. Managing the unknowable is where it hurts. And usually that manifests at crunch time. It's at the end of that project line where there's the scramble, where there's the emoji that we weren't planning for. It hurts when the plan goes into the trash. So how can we plan for the plan going in the trash? And there are ways that we can do that. I want to illustrate that a tiny bit with some of these stories that I mentioned. Okay, so story number one, deploying on my first day. So a few jobs ago, I started a new job at an agency, and on my first day, I discovered that the team was deploying a large site for a big nationwide organization dealing with healthcare. This is what the site looked like. Now I've anonymized this to protect the innocent. Actually, I'm showing a screenshot of it after like 3 or 4 seconds of rendering, so there's nothing on the page at this stage. I could have put something a bit later on, but I would have had to draw more boxes, and I wanted to have less to square out in this particular example, so that's why I've done it at that stage. But enough to say, this is one that I wanted to get right. It was important. It was on a large scale, and on my first morning in the office, my new boss said to me, okay, we've got a problem. This site should have gone live on Friday, and this was Monday morning. So first of all, that's a bit worrisome. First of all, the fact that it was planning to go live on a Friday, but we'll leave that aside. Sometimes that's a thing that you can't avoid. But the next question was, can you help the team figure out the deployment? So yes, I'm fresh-faced. I want to help. Let me get in there and see what we can do. So if we kind of cast our mind back to this timeline that I painted, What we're talking about is figuring out the deployment here on launch day or just after launch day, which of course, I'd be unfair if I was suggesting that that's what the team planned to do there. That's what they wanted to do. Actually, the plan was to do it just before launch day, which of course is a problem. But this is often the way things work. We don't face those challenges until they become right on top of us, and that can be a problem. I want to talk a little bit about the deployment itself, which looked a bit like this. A typical deployment will have a production environment with assets that run a site on there. We'll have a staging environment that'll have a perfect replica of that. The eagle eyes amongst you will notice that that is not a perfect replica, and that is something that we encountered, right? And the reason it wasn't a perfect replica is because the process of deploying it was to have two FTP windows open, one on the live server, one on the staging server, and to drag files from one to the other, and then hit refresh and go, no. No. And that kind of went on for a while, and my palms were getting more and more sweaty as I'm seeing this. And then one of the developers, we'll call him Bob, he thought, well, actually, no, I know what the problem is. There's another asset here. So he started dragging files from his local machine onto the production environment. Yes, that's right. Those are the correct noises to make at that point. Because that didn't solve things. So then Alice got involved as well, and she's on a laptop, and she's moving things across. So at this point, we've got files moving around. None of these environments are the same. And that's not ideal. I think the thing here that's being used, FTP, I prefer to call it FTP. It was nerve-wracking. Anyone still deploying with FTP in the room? Be brave. Nobody? Oh, Smashing Magazine, are you? Let's have a conversation at the end. I don't think that's true. We need to chat. I asked that question recently, and someone shouted out from the back of the room, no, SFTP. Okay, fine. I don't want to be unkind, but if you are using FTP, you are barking mad to bank on that being something that you can depend on. It means that you're in an unknowable state, right? Your deployments are unknowable. You can't repeat them with confidence because you don't remember what came from where. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but it's worth kind of calling out. So, did this go live? Yes, it did. It did go live. Was it correct? Yes, it was. It probably was. Honestly, there's no way of really knowing whether it was correct or not. The client decided they were happy and we moved on, but it's not ideal. How did the next deployment go? Because that's the thing. Once you've got something live, there's always another deployment. So, are you in a stable state that you can do the next deployment and protect the sanctity of the code, right? The integrity of the code? How did the next deployment go? I'm not ready to talk about that yet. This is about 10 years ago, and any day now I'll be ready. Do you need a hug? Yes, I do. But that's okay, because there are lessons that we can learn here, and that's the reason I'm sharing this. One of the lessons I took from this is that version control needs to extend to our deployments and actually get all the way to production. Version control was being used here in this scenario, but it was really being used as a way to kind of contain the code and somewhere to put the code. It actually is something that we should be using to control the versions all the way through to production. Human intervention is undesirable in deployments. We're not very good at repeating processes exactly the same way every time, so that's something I would always try and minimize. And atomic deploys are really preferable to these piecemeal deploys. And what I'm meaning by that is this drag and drop, this kind of changing of the state of your live environment is not desirable. You don't want to mutate that. You really want to create something which is a whole new deployment that you can address. So each thing is kind of atomic. So those are a few of the lessons from that. I'm going to move on to story number 2. Story 2 is a more recent project that I was involved in when I was at RGA, which is a project called Searching for Syria. Now, this is something that we worked on for Google. Some people here may have seen this. It was a site, a content-driven site, purely intending to communicate, the human plight of Syrian refugees. And it was done in coordination not just with Google, but also with UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And it was really an attempt to try and share what is happening, communicate that the people displaced here, the people at risk, are people like us that we can relate to, and use things like the insights that we can get from how people were using the internet over there before the crisis to really resonate with them a little bit more, and then have a bit of a call for help. So this is a site I was really proud. I don't know how well you can see that with the contrast. I think we're okay. I was really proud of this for the message that it had. There are some crazy things going on in here, and there are a few things that straight away you'll see and go, how do you make that perform well? As soon as you start seeing full bleed images and lots of animations and lots of crazy things, it's like, okay, how are we going to do that? And so there are challenges along the way here, but rather than talking about some of the challenges we met with the actual development of the code, because you'll hear some examples of those kind of things later on, I want to talk about how we manage the change. There's plenty of change here, and when I say plenty of change, that's me being passive-aggressive. There was a ton of change. Things changed a long way from inception to delivery, and that's always going to happen when you've got a project which is very significant, has significant political sensitivity, both in the subject matter that it's conveying, but also with the stakeholders are involved. You can't have a company like Google putting this work out into the world in a way that people say, well, they're trying to profit from this. It was very much a question of sharing the information and showing knowledge is power. So there's lots of sensitivity around that. The diversity of the stakeholders was huge. So there's lots of what's the expression? Everyone had a dog in the fight. There are lots of different directions we were being pulled. And, as you might imagine, a project like this had a global launch ahead of it. So again, it's one that I wanted to kind of get right. This was going to be launched not just globally, but on the Google homepage at one point. Sometimes down here, there's like a little call to action, a little tout that promotes something. We were going to get some time on there. That results in a spike in traffic. That is eyeballs coming to your site. So this is definitely something that I kind of wanted us to get right. So if we look back at this project timeline that we've seen before, how can we learn from the things that we did before? Well, first things first, let's move that. Let's get that way down to the other end of the line. That shouldn't come as a surprise. We started to figure out the deployment right at the beginning and made sure we were proving that out from the outset so we could protect the performance and protect things that we're going to get out into the world later on. Doing that meant that some of these kind of funnies went away, but this is still complex. There's still a lot of things that could go wrong between the start and the end of the project. So this was built on Google Cloud infrastructure. And this is great because it meant that we could cater for the kind of deliveries that we knew we'd have to do. We were going to have to deliver sites to be tested by QA. We needed our producers to see the progress and see how we're getting on with things at all the times we were delivering to them. We had to deliver to translations teams who were going to translate the content into lots of different variants and serve it to lots of different audiences, so we needed to deliver there. The clients, of course, needed to see the progress and see how we were getting on throughout. The clients' bosses wanted to see it as well because, again, politically sensitive. And of course, the public. We needed to deliver to the public and the end user at large. So there's lots of different people, lots of different eyeballs at different stages wanted to see things along the way. So my ambition for this, and it's probably very similar to the ambition of lots of people in this room, is to try and get to the point that we could deliver any version of the site at any time throughout that project. It wouldn't be a kind of a build up to one huge hurrah at the end when one thing would go live. We want to be able to deliver different versions at any time of the site. And so, call me crazy, but is this a job for version control? We decided that we'd have a situation where whenever we thought something was good enough to get into to be looked at, we'd create a version of that by tagging it, and every tag would end up yielding a URL that would render the page. So URLs are the web's superpower. I'm a huge fan of URLs, and having an address for every every version of your site is huge. I feel like I share this at every conference talk I ever do because I always rant about how much I love URLs, except Alex Sexton ruined it for me. So forgive me, I've shown this before, but I want to share it with you as well because every URL starts with HTTP double meh. And if you can't remember where that is, there he is. There's the double meh. This joke has been around for a very long time, but I don't care. It's been around so long, in fact, that I'm not using HTTPS in this example. Naughty. Anywho, you're all damaged by that. You can take that with you. But we were talking about creating, a deployable site, having a URL for every version. And the flow for this looked a bit like this. So we'd have a local development environment where we'd build out a site, and that site we'd want to get up to the production environment, similar to how we had before. So, basing everything in our version control system, we were using Git. We'd have a continuous integration server that was watching for activity on Git. Whenever it saw a new tag had been pushed to Git, it would run the build and then push the output of that build to a staging environment. So we get exactly the same output there as we had in our development environment. Then we could decide when we want to sign that off, and then it would go to production. So this is kind of a common way of doing that, getting the site up there. The tool we used, as I mentioned, was Google Cloud's platform for this. We're using App Engine. This actually is not a screenshot of the panel that I had. I took this after I left the company, so we couldn't get to that. But this is fine. This is just something I've harvested from the web. It shows exactly the same thing. And the place of interest really is here, where every deployment that's happened still lives on that environment. And in fact, you could turn on and off any one of those builds. We had a different situation where we would actually, yes, we'd be pointing our production traffic to our live target, but every other instance of the build was still there. It still lived on a URL that we could serve at any time. The URL had the version in it, in the label of the URL. So doing things in this way actually changes this flow a tiny bit, because actually everything is in that same production environment. Now, we don't have a different staging environment to a production environment. Everything is one thing, and that's huge, because that means that you can know where your code is going to live when it actually goes live. And by having these different instances of your build, you can choose what is staged and what's live. New things come along, and you say, okay, well, now they've got new things to stage, new things to test. People can look at those, and when we're ready with the right thing to go live, we'll point our live version at whichever one we choose. It's a really powerful kind of process to go through. This means that all of the demos, all of the discussions, all of the things like the testing that happens, all of the issues that are raised, and the sign-off that happens, those can be done against a URL where you can see right in the URL what is the version of the site that you're looking at. There's no more talk about, well, it worked yesterday, and I can't remember what was deployed. It means that everything is against like a known version. So some lessons to kind of capture from this. Addressable and accessible build versions are just a huge win. It just raises the confidence in what you're building or what you're getting out into the world, so you can protect the quality of what you're deploying. Deciding when and what to tag requires some coordination. This is an area that we could have improved for certain, because deciding, is this a good enough version to actually create an instance of? There was some discussion in that, so perhaps a room for improvement. And then having these kind of atomic deploys, these immutable deploys, right into the production environment rather than a separate staging environment, that just meant that we didn't have the shaky finger of doom pressing the launch button on launch day. Everything was known. We just switched the version, and we're off and running. So those are the lessons from there. So moving on to story number 3. Now, as I mentioned, I recently joined Netlify, so I got to see some insights about how Netlify build Netlify. I wanted to share some of that with you. Now, I'm not talking about the whole product. I'm talking about the website, the .com website, the thing that you would interact with on a day-to-day basis. I've been kind of learning the approach for developing the site and the product, and there's some things that are kind of similar to this that we just saw for the Google Cloud Compute approach that we were taking on the previous project. It actually is fundamentally very much the same, but rather than having a separate continuous integration service and then doing our build and then getting that out into CDNs, that's all kind of wrapped up in this one place in this particular instance. So the CI is there, again, doing the same exact thing that we can do elsewhere, but it's just kind of wrapped up in one place. Now, I mention this because this is our way of taking the Git-based workflow all the way through to the production, all the way through to the CDN level, and that's kind of interesting to me. So I want to illustrate this a little bit by just talking about how netlify.com is a JAMstack site hosted on Netlify using Netlify to Netlify. That's a bit dodgy. I've used the word Netlify a few too many times in there, and I promised at the beginning, but believe me, there's a reason I'm doing this, because I think it's kind of interesting seeing how you can use the same tool to build out the tool that you're serving, but also just because there's some interesting conventions and processes that again you could use in other platforms. I'm just using this one as the example. I also dropped in the word JAMstack there, and it's a term that you're kind of hearing more and more, mostly because I'm shouting about it, but be that as it may. And I just want to kind of just summarize what I mean by JAMstack a tiny bit. Now, when we're talking about build automation and of something that runs a build, like a static site generator perhaps. It's taking markup and perhaps using JavaScript as part of the build or one of the assets of the front end with other kind of front end assets to generate a site. So we've got markup there and JavaScript, creating a static asset that can go out into a CDN, be hosted on any platform, be anywhere. And then the APIs part of that will often we're kind of populating the templates, the things in our static site templates and similar from APIs where you may be using like a headless CMS or where getting things from other data sources can be part of our build to generate a site. Now, equally, JavaScript can be in the front end as well, something that adds more dynamism, maybe enable some other services, and that can be talking to APIs as well. So when I'm talking about JAMstack, I'm talking about this kind of an architecture. Now, in the context of the Netlify site, and in fact, lots of sites that I've seen, the APIs and the things kind of that way, the CDN management, the kind of product, we're not worrying about that for the moment. We're just talking about the site that lives on the front end. This is the deployable thing that gets developed all the time. So I want to just describe a little bit about how that works here. And here, as we've seen in some other examples, builds are based on Git commits, so we can see a history. Now, I love this. I don't know how well people can see this. I think it's pretty visible. Can I get this to play? I wonder. Let's see. No. Come on. There we go. So this is a view of just a list of sites that are in the account on this particular platform. And if we go and choose one of them in particular, we can see all the deploys that have happened. We can look down over time and see all of the deploys that are there based on something that's happened in Git. Now, anyone who's been working in Git will be kind of familiar with this kind of thing of being able to kind of trace back through the commit history. But having this relate to things that have been actually built and deployed, and knowing that you can easily go and see any one of these builds is really kind of interesting. So here we've got a view of a particular build. We can see the build logs that were there. We can actually click through and see the actual change in GitHub that triggered this. So it's binding Git and the actual deployment much more closely together. So we can see what the change was that was triggering this build. In this case, it's a bit of a change to something in the documentation on the site. If we come back and click a different link, we can either see the actual instance of the build itself. This is kind of hard to see. Can people see the URL for that? Just about? Yeah? Great. So you can see that the URL actually includes a hash, which is linked to the actual Git deployment itself, which means that every push to Git will yield a site on a URL that we can always see. That's kind of powerful. It means that you can step back and forward through time. You always know that you can choose to promote one version to live or another, kind of similar to the approach that we saw in App Engine earlier on. When I joined the company, there was a bit of a retrospective that happened where they showed the different states of the site. And this is the site way earlier on. This is it a little bit later, and this is how it looks now, the kind of views we've just looked at now. And the interesting thing to me as I was looking at this was that these aren't screen grabs that were taken. This is just someone going back and saying, okay, well, now I'll take you to the address of the site as it was 2 years ago. And this is a site that's sitting in the front end, talking to APIs in the back end. So all of these sites are actually live. If you look closely, you can see SmashingConf, which was one of the deployments working on the smashing.com site. This is a project that happened recently, but in a site UI from 2 years ago. It's kind of interesting the way that this can happen. So we could step back and forward through these different stages of the site. Now this happens because it's a JAMstack site sitting in front of APIs where lots of the complexity is. And that's a really powerful kind of combination. We're basing the activity there on activity in Git, and it kind of goes a bit further than that. So we can start to see things like builds built from pull requests. We can see build previews. Now this isn't exclusive to Netlify. Tools like Travis do this as well. I think GitLab are also doing something similar. So there's lots of different ways to do it. That's my disclaimer saying I'm not trying to push Netlify, but more the approach. So just let me show you an example of that. So this is a pull request in GitHub. We're very fortunate that the designers will describe what this pull request is going to do and what's going to be the change of it here. But once they actually commit that pull request, there's a little thing here where, very thorough, there's Jessica who's outside, That's actually a bot that's watching for a pull request. When it sees a pull request, it creates a deploy of what the site will look like once that pull request has been merged. This is mind-blowing to me that we can start to see the state of the future before it happens. I really like that very much. And then we can kind of click through on the link to that, go to that deployment. Eventually, there it is. And then we can start to compare side by side, what's the future state once this pull request has been merged versus the state of the site now. This is really powerful for having confidence in your deployments, having confidence in your changes. So you can start to safeguard the quality of the code that you're getting out there, start to safeguard things like the performance of the site. Okay, that means that we've got this confidence in the future state of the site. So some lessons from this. Well, embracing version control conventions removes the need to reinvent them. In previous places or previous ways of working that I've used, we've started to think about how do we do the versioning here? How do we create an instance of something from an activity that we've got? We're actually just reinventing some of the processes that happen right there in Git already. So I think we don't need to reinvent those. The reduced friction that this brings, the confidence in being able to roll back, deploy different things that are there, they're immutable, they exist forever. That just brings incredible agility and confidence to the way that we work. And I think that's really empowering for us. And I also just wanted to kind of highlight that these kind of JAMstack sites can go further than we expect, because there's this huge ecosystems of APIs out there that we can hook into to start to create all kinds of interesting experiences. Okay, enough of that. I want to just kind of talk quickly about the mindsets that this kind of enables and just highlight some of the resources that we can use for this. So I mentioned continuous integration within Netlify, but it can happen without. Of course it can. These are both great tools that are really worth looking at if you haven't already. Most people will have come across Jenkins, I'm sure. Jenkins and also Travis are both really worth looking at. Circle CI is also very much worth looking at when you're thinking about providing continuous integration services to your environment. Also, a lot of these things that I'm talking about are collected together on a couple of places where you can get more information. The new dynamic is a great place to start to see more about using either static site generators or different ways of deploying things, different processes, different tooling. And likewise, jamstack.org, both are kind of useful places to find more information. But really, it's about the mindset. This is the thing that I want to get across more than anything today. It's the move from using FTP to using something which is slightly different and start to build that mindset into the way that we work. Now, version control for everything, is key, because if there's some part of your environment, some part of your process that isn't under version control, that's where your headache is going to be. That's just the way that life goes. Having this approach where you try and expose the red lights in a project as early as possible rather than waiting until you encounter a problem later is key. When we once again kind of draw this kind of timeline of a project, and we're happily working away up until the point that we're going to have to do something different, we're going to have to eventually deploy to a production environment, and that's when the unknown is. Leaving that until the end means that the problems happen at the end, where it's a scramble and it becomes a bigger problem. And then you've got more things to fix because it's a little bit unwieldy. And then eventually you kind of get to the point that you're happy and things go out live. You're always going to have these kind of red traffic lights. That's always going to happen. So the key, I think, is to face them early. Face your demons early. Get to the point that you're proving your environments as fast as possible so you can overcome one problem at a time, discover the next one when it's not crunch time. So you can keep moving through and eventually kind of get to the point that you're deployed, you're live, you're happy. A note on deployment, make it scripted. Don't be letting yourself be part of the process. Get yourself out of the process as fast as possible. Make it scripted so it's repeatable, it's predictable, and it's kind of documented. Make it automated. Have it triggered by events that you'll be doing on your development workflow already, because it's a great way to expose what is happening and start to kind of prove things out early. Make it real. Make it something that is a deployment to an environment that actually is your production environment, rather than something which is a staging environment or some kind of facsimile that you hope is identical to production. Because as soon as you make it real, you'll start to expose the real problems. Make it first. Make it right up at the beginning so you can see that as often as possible. Now, it's an awfully full stack of things to develop on now. I think people who were at Vitaly's workshop yesterday covered a ton of ground, lots of different types of things were being discussed there. And even that is focused, predominantly in a few aspects of front-end development. There's a lot to take on here. So, we should use the skills of others. There are lots of services out there, lots of APIs, lots of services, lots of content providers that we can build on top of so that we can focus our attention on the things that we really care about. There's always going to be times of chaos on a project. You should always expect that. We shouldn't let our infrastructure or our workflow be something that introduces that chaos. Face your demons early is the thing that I think is key. Get those out of the way so that you can really spend the best part of your time working on the things that you care about, and that's creating good sites to get out into the world. So I make that 40 minutes and 37 seconds. I'm done. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. The slides are available for this talk. They're on the URL, which I'll tweet out again later on. But thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Phil. So that was such a good talk. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
There are a lot of really, really good questions here, so I'm just going to go right into it.
Okay.
So do you have any tips or considerations for migrating from or updating systems built on legacy stacks? I know this is something that you face.
Right, yeah. So moving from one situation to another, that's always going to be hard, right? That's always going to be difficult. I mean, I think looking to see which parts you can decouple, that's always the first thing to do, because very often on a legacy stack, you'll find that there's very tight coupling between the different parts of the project, and until you can figure out what you can decouple and kind of simplify, you can't move that across, right? So I think identifying which pieces can be self-contained, which pieces will be able to talk to services that you kind of keep where they are, that can often be a good place to start. I've seen quite a lot of chatter recently about people moving from a WordPress environment across to something slightly different. I think it's kind of fashionable at the moment to start playing with Jekyll or playing with Hugo or Gatsby and those kind of things. They're exciting and they're fun, and there's people are kind of getting enthusiastic about that. But it's hard to move. And there are some interesting articles out there on doing exactly that, particularly from WordPress. WordPress now you can start to use as a headless CMS, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, cool.
So you can still use the WordPress administration, but then you can use its content APIs to drive a static site generator as well. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. So there are ways that you can slowly start to break the pieces apart and then figure out what you can take and move along.
Yeah.
But migrating is hard. Yeah.
So kind of on that same vein, how do you manage the back end and front end when they're on different versions of repos? Like, for example, if you make a breaking change to the API, how do you kind of manage all of that?
So versioning APIs is kind of core to designing for scale and designing for longevity. There's no substitute for keeping sustained APIs versioned and around for as long as you possibly can, and also documenting those really, really well. That's one of the things that often falls through the cracks. Like understanding why an API is there, what it does and what it doesn't do. That kind of lives and breathes in the documentation.
Yeah.
And doing that from the beginning, we were kind of talking a little bit about that yesterday, I think. Making that very apparent, what version of the APIs exist and what they do and how you can build on them, that's kind of key. But yeah, keeping APIs versioned is a bit of an art, but that's a key principle. Yeah.
Totally. So version your front end and your back end, important.
Version everything.
Version all the things.
Everything.
I like semantic versioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how far can JAMstack take us? Is it applicable to every challenge? Where does it fall short?
I would love to be able to say yes because I'm enthusiastic about it. But
and it's your job.
Well, JAMstack isn't my job per se.
Yeah.
However, I'm very enthusiastic about it for sure. And it's not suitable for everything. I'd be crazy to say it's like the silver bullet, which is for everything. But I'm starting to see that it can do more than we might expect. I mean, there was mention earlier on about, I think actually Patrick said, oh, well, you've got a nice new site, Smashing Magazine, and that's a JAMstack site. Right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of site that we would never have thought would be able to sit on the JAMstack a few years ago. I always used to think that, well, it's fine for a static site, but as soon as you want comments, for instance, sure, there are tools like Discuss that can do that in the JavaScript in the front end, but I prefer to have content in the site as much as possible. But there are more and more approaches that open these things up to us now. So, yeah, I would classify Smashing Magazine as a JAMstack site. It's got e-commerce on there. It's got comments. It's got membership. Yeah. There's a lot on there, and it's the kind of things that I would normally have said those are beyond the reaches of what we can do. But the ecosystem is really growing. The tools are there. The services are there. Some of them are open source. Some of them are, services that you can pay for and subscribe to. But the complexity is still there, but you don't have to own it.
Totally.
That's the thing, right? So it's hard to be an expert in everything. And if you can find a service that will do identity for you, like things like Auth0, you can push some of that heavy lifting out to the people who can be experts at it and just use that service yourself.
Yeah.
So for sure, and to answer your question, it can't do everything, but it could do more than maybe you might expect at first glance. And I think the boundaries, we're still kind of testing where that goes. I had a conversation with someone just outside earlier on where they're saying, okay, well, this kind of generating sites statically, a JAMstack approach is interesting, but can you do that for 1 billion pages? Because we've got a big site, we've got lots and lots of content. I was like, okay, I don't know how long a Hugo build will take to render 1 billion pages, but it's a lot. So there are environments where it won't be appropriate, but even for smashing, you have lots and lots of content. There are approaches to kind of sharding your content, developing against a section of the content, and then your build runs against a bigger piece of the content. So there are approaches to kind of take it further.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's definitely the approach that I like to take as well, and I'm seeing more people do it more often. JAMstack, that term really kind of just strung all the pieces together.
Yeah.
So that graphic that you showed up there was excellent.
Okay, good. I'm glad that kind of helps.
Yeah, that's great. So last question, how do you see JAMstack evolving over time as browsers and needs are changing?
That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, JAMstack, like the term JAMstack is more thinking about it's a concept, it's an approach, it's not any one particular, yes, it's got JavaScript listed in there, it's got markup listed in there, but it's not really about the technologies. It really is kind of agnostic. It's more about, I think of it as an approach to create an asset that you can put onto a CDN, or you can put on, you can put on S3, you can put wherever you want. So it's not really coupled to the actual code. We can support with this approach any technologies that come along. As browser needs and browser technologies change and evolve, that's not really coupled to this. So I think it's actually a great enabler so that we can focus on that rather than being, sometimes we're a little bit shackled by the complexity in the back end that prescribes the way that front end can be delivered. Sometimes as front end developers we don't have all of the freedoms that we might otherwise want. So actually I think this fits really nicely there to let us play in that space and do more to kind of support the browsers as they evolve.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. That was such a great talk.
Thank you very much.
Phil Hawksworth, everyone.